In the early 14th century, Europe moved according to rhythms that had barely changed for generations, shaped by soil, belief, and season rather than foresight or scientific understanding. Cities and villages functioned as closed ecosystems, where people, animals, refuse, and faith coexisted in confined spaces that few questioned and none truly examined. Illness was not perceived as an external threat, but as a familiar presence, expected within life itself, unnamed, feared, and rarely investigated. Medical knowledge relied on inherited texts, superstition, and religious interpretation, offering comfort through explanation rather than meaningful protection or prevention. Urban growth had far outpaced sanitation, producing narrow streets where moisture lingered, waste accumulated, and air itself was believed to carry danger. Across land and sea, trade routes expanded steadily, binding distant regions together through commerce while silently linking their shared vulnerabilities. Ports, markets, and caravan roads moved goods efficiently, yet they also carried unseen forces that traveled faster than rumors or warnings. Most people understood the world only through local experience, unaware that distant events could shape their fate without notice or delay. Religious certainty provided structure and reassurance, framing misfortune as divine will rather than biological consequence or environmental failure. Communities responded to hardship through prayer, ritual, and obedience, trusting that moral order could restore balance to the physical world. Living conditions differed little between regions, shaped by similar construction, similar diets, and the same dependence on animals and shared water sources. Homes were crowded and dim, designed for survival rather than comfort, with little separation between sleeping, working, and storage spaces. Animals lived close to humans, essential for labor and food, yet unknowingly bridging the divide between wilderness and domestic life. Hygiene followed habit rather than science, guided by tradition, scarcity, and belief instead of any understanding of contagion. Illness was often explained as imbalance, corrupted air, or spiritual failing, interpretations that discouraged inquiry but encouraged acceptance. Warnings from distant lands arrived rarely and in fragments, easily dismissed as exaggeration or irrelevant to familiar routines. Few imagined that a single force could overwhelm every class, every region, and every institution at the same time. History suggested that crises were local and temporary, not continental, sustained, or transformative. This assumption shaped expectations, leaving societies mentally unprepared for events that would ignore borders, customs, and belief systems. The world appeared stable not because it was safe, but because its dangers were familiar and seemingly contained. That sense of continuity concealed deeper fragility, hidden beneath routines that had never been tested at true scale. Within this fragile equilibrium, Europe stood unaware that its greatest trial was already moving silently toward its shores. The first signs of disruption did not arrive as catastrophe, but as distant whispers, filtered through merchants' tales and travelers' caution rather than any formal warning or shared sense of alarm. Reports described illness beyond familiar borders, framed as regional misfortune rather than evidence of a pattern that might repeat itself closer to home or affect established routines. Such accounts rarely inspired fear, because distance itself acted as reassurance, separating rumor from lived experience and allowing concern to remain abstract and easily dismissed. Trade continued without interruption, driven by necessity and habit, as economic survival consistently outweighed vague concern over threats that could not yet be seen or measured. Merchants followed established routes, trusting routine over speculation, unaware that the same paths sustaining prosperity were now carrying more than goods and correspondence. Along coastal approaches, ships arrived as they always had, bearing cargo, sailors, and the invisible consequences of long journeys that no one yet knew how to interpret. No system existed to inspect, isolate, or delay movement, as delay itself was considered more dangerous than uncertainty in economies dependent on constant circulation. Ports functioned as arteries of prosperity, and closing them would have threatened livelihoods already balanced on fragile margins shaped by scarcity and obligation. Illness arriving by sea was interpreted as coincidence rather than cause, its origins obscured by superstition, limited observation, and deeply rooted assumptions. As weeks passed, stories multiplied and overlapped, no longer isolated events, yet still lacking any shared explanation or coordinated response across regions. Communities processed these developments through familiar frameworks, blending rumor with scripture and inherited wisdom rather than seeking new forms of understanding. Clerical authorities interpreted suffering through moral narratives, reinforcing obedience and repentance instead of encouraging inquiry or practical intervention. Local healers offered remedies based on balance and prayer, repeating methods that had always promised reassurance even when recovery remained uncertain. Meanwhile, ordinary life persisted, anchored by daily labor and obligation, leaving little space for abstract fear or distant concern to alter behavior. People judged danger by what they could see directly, and what they saw still appeared manageable, familiar, and contained within known limits. The absence of immediate collapse strengthened the belief that disruption remained distant and temporary, reinforcing confidence in existing social structures. This confidence delayed adaptation, discouraging even minor changes that might have limited exposure, movement, or contact within shared environments. What seemed like resilience was, in reality, inertia reinforced by tradition, economic necessity, and deep reliance on established patterns. The social order depended on continuity, and continuity was protected deliberately, even as conditions subtly shifted beneath everyday routines. By the time absence became noticeable and routines began to falter, the opportunity for early response had already passed unnoticed. Uncertainty spread unevenly, shaped by class, proximity to trade, and access to information rather than any shared understanding. Europe continued forward, still convinced that familiar structures would absorb whatever disturbances lay ahead without lasting consequence. Movement across Europe did not slow as uncertainty increased. Roads, rivers, and ports continued to bind regions together, reinforcing habits of travel that had sustained trade and survival for generations. These familiar rhythms created reassurance. Continuity itself was interpreted as stability, even as connections multiplied faster than understanding could adapt to changing conditions. Caravans moved inland from harbors carrying grain, cloth, and metalwork. Alongside goods traveled proximity, contact, and shared space, variables no one yet recognized as dangerous. River routes compressed distance and time. Barges carried people and cargo deep into the interior, spreading interaction more efficiently than any rumor could spread awareness. Markets depended on density. Crowded stalls, shared waits, reused containers, and constant negotiation formed the core of economic life, leaving little room for restraint or separation. Urban centers required uninterrupted supply. Any restriction threatened hunger immediately, while illness remained abstract, distant, and poorly defined by comparison. Authorities hesitated to interfere with commerce. Political structures were designed to preserve order, not disrupt livelihoods without clear cause or precedent. Inspection systems were minimal. Travel permits were rare, enforcement inconsistent, and responsibility fragmented across jurisdictions with limited coordination. When illness appeared, it was interpreted locally. Each town saw itself as an isolated case, shaped by its own circumstances rather than part of a larger pattern. Symptoms varied widely. Some fell ill suddenly, others recovered quickly, and inconsistency obscured any clear explanation linking cases together. Survival often reinforced complacency. Each recovery suggested resilience, allowing communities to rationalize loss without altering behavior. Explanations adapted to outcomes. Prayer, fortune, and personal constitution were credited, avoiding uncomfortable questions about shared exposure. Movement continued faster than awareness. Routes once celebrated for prosperity quietly became channels of vulnerability without visible transformation. No boundary marked danger. Roads appeared unchanged, ships arrived intact, and markets remained familiar, making precaution feel unnecessary. Without visible signs, restraint seemed irrational. Daily survival demanded action, not hesitation, and habit carried greater authority than warning. Information traveled slowly. Language barriers, class divisions, and distance fragmented knowledge, preventing recognition of scale or coordination. Local authorities responded only when absence became undeniable. Labor shortages disrupted production, and burial counts began to rise. By then, responses were reactive. Measures emerged from urgency rather than foresight, improvised without shared framework or preparation. Attempts at isolation varied widely. Some were enforced briefly, others resisted or reversed under pressure from economic necessity. Movement resumed repeatedly. Each reopening reinforced cycles of exposure that no single community could interrupt alone. The network endured because it had to. Survival depended on it, even as that endurance carried consequences not yet understood. What connected Europe now also bound its fate together, long before that reality could be clearly named or accepted. At first, disruption revealed itself through absence rather than spectacle. Familiar faces failed to appear, routines lost participants, and small gaps emerged in places where continuity had once seemed automatic. Workshops opened later. Stalls remained unattended. Tasks normally shared were redistributed unevenly, forcing adjustments that felt temporary, though no one could yet define their cause. Labor shortages were explained pragmatically. Illness, travel delays, or seasonal strain were cited, preserving the assumption that disruption remained limited and reversible. Fields required hands that did not arrive. Harvest schedules slipped, not from catastrophe, but from incremental strain accumulating without a single defining moment. In towns, essential services slowed. Repairs waited longer, transport lagged, and coordination faltered as overlapping absences disrupted informal chains of responsibility. These delays carried consequences. Food distribution became uneven, prices fluctuated unpredictably, and access depended increasingly on proximity rather than order. Authorities responded cautiously. Intervention risked panic, and reassurance remained the preferred tool, even as signs multiplied beyond comfortable explanation. Public notices emphasized calm. Responsibility was framed as individual, reinforcing obedience rather than addressing structural vulnerability. Care for the ill-strained households first. Family members absorbed responsibility quietly, concealing severity to avoid scrutiny or restriction. As sickness lingered, recovery timelines lengthened. What had been assumed temporary now resisted familiar rhythms of healing. Burial practices shifted subtly. Ceremonies shortened, gatherings thinned, and repetition replaced ritual without formal acknowledgement of change. Religious spaces absorbed uncertainty. Prayer intensified, processions multiplied, and interpretation leaned toward moral causation rather than material inquiry. Markets reflected imbalance. Supply faltered sporadically, demand surged unevenly, and negotiation grew tense where trust had once governed exchange. Rumors adapted quickly. Each new absence fed speculation, blending observation with inherited explanation until clarity dissolved into noise. Some communities attempted isolation informally. Streets were avoided, gatherings reduced, and contact narrowed through habit rather than decree. These measures lacked consistency. Economic pressure undermined restraint, and necessity forced repeated compromise between caution and survival. Travel persisted, though altered. Journeys became shorter, purposes narrower, yet movement itself remained essential, resisting full suspension. Records failed to capture scale. Loss was registered locally, not collectively, preventing recognition of cumulative impact across regions. Confidence eroded gradually. Certainty gave way not to panic, but to fatigue, as effort increased without visible resolution. Adaptation emerged unevenly. Some adjusted quickly, others clung to precedent, and divergence replaced shared response. What had once been resilience now resembled fragility, revealed not by collapse, but by the system's inability to absorb sustained disruption. Europe had not yet broken, but its foundations were no longer silent. Strain had become audible, even if its meaning remained contested. Recognition did not arrive suddenly. It emerged as patterns repeated, absences overlapped, and explanation grew harder to sustain through routine language alone. What had once seemed isolated began to align. Similar disruptions appeared across distant towns, linked not by message, but by resemblance. Travelers carried accounts unintentionally. Stories compared symptoms, timing, and loss, revealing parallels no single community had documented alone. Merchants noticed routes behaving differently. Delays clustered, markets weakened together, and reliability eroded beyond local circumstance. Urban centers compared shortages. Grain failed to arrive simultaneously, labor thinned across districts, and coincidence became difficult to dismiss. Clerks struggled to categorize events. Records designed for disputes or trade now registered illness and absence without precedent or structure. Language lagged behind experience. Familiar terms could not contain scale, forcing metaphor and belief to fill analytical gaps. Authorities requested reports cautiously. Information was gathered without urgency, filtered through concern for order rather than comprehension. Responses varied by region. Some councils restricted movement briefly, others delayed action, awaiting clarity that never arrived intact. Medical knowledge offered little certainty. Symptoms defied classification, treatments conflicted, and recovery followed no reliable sequence. Healers debated causes quietly. Humors, air, and influence were discussed, each explanation insufficient yet defended by tradition. Religious interpretation intensified. Processions expanded, prayer became public reassurance, and moral reasoning substituted for diagnosis. Communities reacted unevenly. Some accepted intervention, others resisted constraint, fearing hunger more than illness. Markets reflected this tension. Exchange persisted under strain, adapting through improvisation rather than coordination. Travel declined unevenly. Distance shortened journeys, but necessity preserved connection where survival depended on it. Isolation measures fractured quickly. Without shared enforcement, restraint dissolved under pressure from daily requirement. Rumors sharpened perception. Fear traveled faster than policy, shaping behavior before instruction arrived. Loss became measurable. Burial counts increased, space tightened, and repetition forced acknowledgement beyond explanation. Confidence fractured slowly. Trust in continuity weakened, replaced by vigilance without clear direction. Patterns became visible, though unnamed. Recognition existed without consensus, suspended between awareness and response. Europe stood at a threshold. Understanding approached not through revelation, but accumulation, as evidence outpaced denial. What followed would not be confusion alone, but decision, shaped by how long recognition had been delayed. Awareness shifted when repetition demanded language. What had been endured silently now required articulation, as experience outgrew inherited explanations and demanded clearer definition. Communities began assigning names. Terms varied by region, drawing from scripture, folklore, or observation, but all marked a transition from anomaly to recognized condition. Descriptions grew more precise. Accounts compared swelling, fever, and collapse, narrowing attention toward common features rather than isolated misfortune. Messengers carried these descriptions deliberately. Letters, sermons, and word of mouth spread detail alongside fear, standardizing perception without formal authority. Medical practitioners adapted terminology cautiously. Classical references were reinterpreted, symptoms grouped, and uncertainty framed within familiar theoretical limits. This act of naming altered behavior. What could be described could be anticipated, and anticipation reshaped how risk was perceived and discussed. Markets reacted immediately. Certain goods were avoided, others hoarded, and proximity became a factor weighed consciously rather than ignored. Households reorganized space. Sleeping arrangements shifted, utensils were separated, and contact narrowed through informal precaution rather than official instruction. Religious authorities responded with interpretation. Naming was absorbed into moral frameworks, aligning physical suffering with spiritual cause and response. Public rituals evolved accordingly. Processions took new routes, prayers targeted specific affliction, and repetition reinforced collective recognition. Local governance adjusted language carefully. Notices acknowledged illness without conceding loss of control, balancing clarity against reassurance. Restrictions appeared tentatively. Entry was discouraged, gatherings limited, and movement monitored inconsistently, reflecting uncertainty rather than strategy. Resistance followed swiftly. Naming the threat intensified fear for some, denial for others, sharpening division within communities. Trade routes adapted unevenly. Some towns closed briefly, others remained open, and inconsistency undermined containment. Records improved incrementally. Counts became more systematic, though still fragmented, allowing comparison across time but not geography. This partial clarity revealed scale. Patterns once invisible emerged through accumulation, confronting observers with magnitude beyond expectation. Confidence in tradition weakened. Established knowledge failed to explain progression, exposing limits long masked by continuity. Yet knowledge did not arrive fully formed. Naming clarified presence, not mechanism, leaving cause contested and response uncertain. Fear shifted character. No longer abstract, it attached to specific signs, places, and behaviours, shaping daily decision-making. Communities entered a new phase. Awareness no longer lagged behind experience, but action still lagged behind awareness. What had been endured became acknowledged. The threat was now named, even if its nature remained only partially understood. Certainty did not disappear at once. It fractured unevenly, eroded by repetition rather than shock, as explanations failed to produce relief or resolution. What had been named could no longer be dismissed. Familiar language now carried weight, forcing individuals to confront persistence rather than anomaly. Households adjusted behaviour more decisively. Contact narrowed, visits declined, and precautions shifted from suggestion to instinctive routine. Public spaces reflected restraint. Streets emptied at irregular hours, gatherings thinned, and absence became an accepted feature of daily movement. Work continued under altered conditions. Tasks were performed cautiously, cooperation reduced, and proximity avoided where possible, even at the cost of efficiency. Markets adapted defensively. Exchange became brief, trust conditional, and negotiation compressed by unease rather than governed by custom. Medical authority weakened visibly. Conflicting advice undermined confidence, and uncertainty replaced expectation of guidance. Healers withdrew into theory. Without effective treatment, explanation became consolation rather than instruction. Religious confidence strained similarly. Prayer persisted, but expectation of intervention faded as repetition outpaced reassurance. Communal rituals lost cohesion. Participation declined, timing fragmented, and collective rhythm gave way to individual calculation. Governance faced erosion of compliance. Orders were questioned, selectively followed, or ignored when survival conflicted with instruction. Restrictions intensified unevenly. Some areas enforced separation strictly, others lacked capacity, producing disparity rather than control. Travel continued selectively. Essential movement persisted, while discretionary journeys vanished, reshaping networks without dissolving them. Fear matured into vigilance. Behavior was guided less by panic than by sustained alertness to signs and proximity. Loss accumulated visibly. Familiar names disappeared from routine, transforming statistics into absence with emotional weight. Memory altered perception. Each new encounter was framed by prior loss, narrowing tolerance for uncertainty. Confidence in continuity collapsed quietly. The expectation of return to normal dissolved without announcement or ceremony. Europe entered a state of suspension, no longer anticipating resolution, but learning to endure without clarity. As certainty weakened, response lost unity. Without shared understanding, action diverged, shaped more by circumstance than by coordinated intent. Some communities turned inward. Boundaries tightened, familiarity narrowed, and survival became a local calculation rather than a collective concern. Elsewhere, continuity was defended. Trade, worship, and labor persisted, driven by necessity and disbelief rather than confidence or reassurance. Movement revealed disparity. Towns along the same routes adopted opposing measures, transforming travel into a sequence of abrupt behavioral shifts. Information circulated unevenly. Reports arrived incomplete, delayed, or reshaped by fear, preventing alignment between perception and reality. Authorities struggled to adapt. Instructions changed frequently, undermining trust and encouraging selective interpretation rather than compliance. Enforcement proved inconsistent. Limited resources and local resistance reduced measures to gestures rather than effective barriers. Medical practice fractured further. Treatments varied widely, and absence of consensus intensified uncertainty instead of resolving it. Households filled the gap. Decisions once guided externally became domestic judgments shaped by experience, rumor, and proximity. Markets reflected fragmentation. Some enforced distance informally, others ignored risk entirely, prioritizing immediate exchange. Religious response diverged sharply. Certain congregations intensified ritual, while others withdrew, interpreting restraint as responsibility. Social bonds adjusted accordingly. Neighborhoods fractured into smaller units, redefining trust through shared exposure rather than tradition. Fear adapted to inconsistency. The absence of uniform response created vigilance without direction, exhausting attention over time. Loss accumulated unevenly. Disparity between regions became visible, intensifying resentment alongside grief. Comparison replaced expectation. Communities measured themselves against others, seeking meaning in difference rather than outcome. No single strategy prevailed. Fragmentation prevented escalation into control, allowing the crisis to persist unchecked. Europe entered prolonged instability, shaped not by ignorance alone, but by an inability to act together. Institutions responded by retreat rather than reform. Faced with uncertainty they could not resolve, many narrowed their role, preserving authority by limiting exposure instead of expanding responsibility. Administrative offices reduced visibility. Access became restricted, decisions delayed, and communication filtered to avoid provoking unrest or expectation. Governance shifted toward containment. Rather than managing causes, authorities focused on regulating movement, defining boundaries, and limiting contact where possible. These measures varied widely. Some regions enforced controls rigorously, while others lacked capacity, producing uneven application and confusion. Legal frameworks strained under pressure. Existing rules proved inadequate, forcing improvisation that blurred the line between guidance and coercion. Public trust weakened further. Inconsistent enforcement suggested uncertainty, eroding confidence in institutional competence and intent. Military presence increased selectively, not to confront illness, but to reinforce order where civilian authority faltered. Barricades appeared in strategic locations. Streets narrowed, access points monitored, and space itself became an instrument of control. These interventions altered daily life. Familiar routes disappeared, routines fractured, and navigation became a negotiation rather than habit. Economic consequences followed quickly. Trade slowed under restriction, labor mobility declined, and scarcity intensified across dependent sectors. Institutions prioritized survival over service. Resources were conserved, obligations deferred, and responsibility redistributed downward to households and guilds. Charitable systems strained. Demand increased while capacity shrank, exposing reliance on continuity that no longer existed. Communication hardened in tone. Orders replaced explanation, signaling a shift from persuasion to compliance. Resistance surfaced intermittently. Controls conflicted with necessity, forcing individuals to choose between obedience and subsistence. Punitive measures escalated unevenly. Fines, confinement, and exclusion appeared where compliance failed, deepening resentment. Institutional withdrawal did not restore stability. It preserved form while conceding substance, maintaining presence without resolution. Europe entered a phase of managed disorder. Authority remained visible, but its ability to guide outcomes diminished markedly. As institutional control faltered, society reorganized itself from the ground up. Adaptation no longer followed instruction, but emerged through necessity, habit, and observation. Households became primary units of decision. Choices once deferred to authority were now negotiated internally, shaped by proximity and immediate risk. Extended families fragmented. Contact narrowed to essential interaction, weakening kinship networks that had structured daily life for generations. Neighborhoods redefined trust. Familiarity was reassessed through exposure, replacing tradition with cautious evaluation. Work adapted unevenly. Some trade ceased entirely, while others persisted under modified practices that prioritized distance over efficiency. Guilds absorbed responsibility. In the absence of coordination, occupational groups imposed their own rules to preserve continuity. Markets reflected this shift. Informal norms replaced oversight, governing spacing, timing, and exchange through collective improvisation. Gender roles adjusted subtly. Care, labor, and decision-making redistributed as necessity outweighed custom. Children experienced disruption differently. Education paused, routines dissolved, and learning became incidental rather than structured. Social hierarchy blurred temporarily. Shared vulnerability diminished visible distinction, even as inequality persisted beneath the surface. Migration increased locally. Individuals relocated within regions, seeking safety without abandoning livelihood entirely. Urban density was reassessed. Crowded quarters emptied partially, while peripheral spaces gained temporary importance. Ritual adapted again. Ceremonies contracted, symbolism intensified, and participation became selective rather than communal. Communication shifted tone. Conversation centered on risk, absence, and precaution, redefining social interaction. Isolation altered perception of time. Days lost distinction, routine slowed, and anticipation replaced planning. Collective memory began to form. Experience crystallized into shared understanding, even without consensus. Society did not collapse. It reshaped itself quietly, sustaining function through adjustment rather than cohesion. As the crisis persisted, attention shifted from response to remembrance. Experience hardened into narrative, shaping how events were understood rather than how they were managed. Survival became unevenly interpreted. Those who endured sought explanation, while absence left gaps that speculation rushed to fill. Stories circulated locally. Accounts varied by region, reflecting proximity, loss, and the limits of observation. Blame followed familiar paths. Foreignness, deviation, and difference were reframed as causes, reinforcing existing divisions. Religious meaning intensified selectively. Some interpreted endurance as favor, others loss as judgment, embedding moral conclusions into memory. Medical failure redefined expectation. Confidence in intervention diminished, replaced by resignation and caution. Written records expanded unevenly. Chroniclers focused on disruption, marking time by loss rather than continuity. Oral transmission preserved immediacy. Memory became experimental, carried through anecdote rather than analysis. Communities began to ritualize remembrance. Anniversaries, offerings, and altered customs fixed experience into collective practice. Architecture reflected change. Spaces once communal were redesigned, narrowing access and separating function. Language adapted subtly. Words associated with contact, gathering, and exchange acquired cautionary weight. Education absorbed distortion. Instruction resumed selectively, shaped by lessons inferred rather than taught. Authority recast itself retrospectively. Decisions were justified after the fact, reframed as necessity rather than uncertainty. The absence of resolution lingered. No single explanation satisfied, allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. These memories influenced behaviour long after immediate threat faded. Precaution outlasted danger. The crisis concluded without closure. It ended not by solution, but by exhaustion and adaptation. What remained was not unity, but awareness. A shared understanding that stability could dissolve without warning. The aftermath did not announce itself dramatically. Change emerged gradually, embedded in behaviour rather than decree, shaping society long after immediate danger receded. Patterns of caution persisted. Movement remained measured, gatherings reconsidered, and proximity treated with enduring awareness. Economic activity recovered unevenly. Some sectors adapted permanently, while others never fully regained previous structure or scale. Urban life reorganized spatially. Density was reconsidered, boundaries reasserted, and separation normalized within daily design. Institutional authority recalibrated its language. Certainty was avoided, experience referenced, and precedent invoked cautiously. Medical practice advanced incrementally. Failure prompted reflection, encouraging observation and record rather than assumption. Education incorporated memory implicitly. Lessons absorbed caution without formal articulation, shaping expectation across generations. Religious interpretation softened over time. Absolutes gave way to ambiguity, allowing coexistence of meaning rather than resolution. Law absorbed flexibility. Temporary measures informed future response, embedding adaptability into governance. Cultural expression reflected restraint. Art, ritual, and custom acknowledged loss without glorification or spectacle. Interpersonal trust reformed slowly. Proximity regained function, but never innocence. Collective memory stabilized. Experience became reference rather than wound, guiding response without dominating identity. The event receded into history. Its presence remained indirect, shaping systems rather than consciousness. What endured was transformation. Not collapse, but reconfiguration driven by survival and learning. Europe moved forward altered, carrying adjustment as inheritance. Stability returned cautiously. Awareness remained, informing continuity rather than preventing it. The crisis passed, but its imprint remained. History recorded not only loss, but adaptation.